All right, ready to dive in. Today, we're tackling API documentation.
API documentation.
Yeah, API documentation. It might not sound super exciting,
Right.
but I think it's way more interesting than people realize.
Yeah.
And we've got a great guide for this deep dive, Curt Robbins.
Oh, okay.
This guy, he's a senior technical writer.
Isn't a technical writer, huh?
Yeah, he's worked with some big names like FedEx and Microsoft.
Wow, that's impressive, yeah.
Yeah, even Wells Fargo.
Okay, so we're in good hands then.
Definitely.
So what's so fascinating about API documentation, you said?
Well, it's kind of like this hidden language. It powers like so much of how we use the internet.
Huh, I never thought about it that way.
It's all those instructions that let different software systems actually talk to each other.
Oh, so it's like the glue that holds everything together.
Exactly. And Robbins, he does a really good job of connecting how API documentation evolved
Okay.
alongside like the internet itself.
So how does that work?
It's a good question. He points out, like, think about how the internet started. It wouldn't be what it is today if we didn't have all this communication happening behind the scenes.
Right, I guess that makes sense.
So from those early web services,
Yeah.
all the way to like, the giants.
The big guys.
Yeah, the big guys like Amazon Web Services, social media, all that clear documentation, it became essential.
I see.
Because companies, they started to realize that developers, they needed a way to actually get into these systems.
It's like a set of instructions, right?
Exactly. It's like if you're trying to build a house on someone else's land,
Okay.
you've got to have a blueprint, right?
Yeah,
Some kind of shared language.
makes sense.
And what's really cool is Robbins, he talks about the shift towards API-first companies.
API first.
Yeah, like Twilio and Stripe.
Yeah.
For these companies, developer-friendly documentation. It's a core value.
It's not just an afterthought.
No, not at all. It's built into how they do business from the start.
That's interesting.
So we've got companies opening up their systems, this need for clear instructions for developers, and now companies where documentation is king.
Wow. Yeah, you're right. This is way more important than I thought.
Right. So let's get into the specifics. Robbins, he lays out the key ingredients for making really great API documentation. And one that stood out to me was consistent formatting.
Consistent formatting.
Yeah. Sounds basic,
Yeah.
but I bet you've got some developer horror stories about this one.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Inconsistent formatting is like the worst.
That'd be a nightmare.
It's a nightmare. Like trying to follow a recipe
Okay.
where like halfway through the measurements change from cups to tablespoons.
Oh, gosh, yeah, I can see that.
Robbins actually gives a good example in the article. He talks about using a style guide specifically for code examples. So they always like visually stand out. It's a small thing, but it makes a huge difference for being able to read the documentation easily.
So it's not just about aesthetics. It's about making sure the developers can find the information they need.
Exactly.
Quickly.
Quickly and efficiently, yeah.
So good documentation goes beyond just explaining what the API does.
Yeah.
It has to anticipate potential problems, too.
Right. Right. Because remember, we're dealing with code here, and code, things can go wrong
Yeah,
in so many different ways.
a million ways.
So good error handling is super important.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So instead of just giving the developer some cryptic error code,
Yeah.
the documentation should explain what went wrong,
Right.
why it went wrong,
And how to fix it.
ideally. Yeah.
Robbins even suggests including like real-world examples
Oh, okay.
where those errors might actually happen so developers can figure out how to fix their code way faster.
That's smart. Makes it less intimidating, especially if someone's new to an API or just having a bad day.
Definitely.
Now, Robbins also gets into some documentation disasters.
Oh, no.
I'm guessing ignoring API versioning is at the top of that list.
100%. It's like trying to put together IKEA furniture,
Yeah.
but using the instructions for a completely different model.
Right.
It's not going to work.
It's not going to work.
Same with APIs. If your documentation doesn't clearly show what's changed between versions, developers are going to waste a lot of time.
Totally.
Robbins, he actually recommends a specific format for documenting these changes, using like a change log that highlights the additions, anything that's been taken away, or modifications.
So everyone's on the same page.
Exactly.
Smart. So we've got consistent formatting, error handling, versioning.
Yeah.
It's like building a solid foundation for developers.
Yeah, you're right, it is. But
Even with the best intentions.
even with the best intentions, things can still go sideways.
Oh, for sure.
What else can go wrong?
Well, another thing Robbins points out is overwhelming developers with too much information.
Okay.
It's like drinking from a fire hose.
Too much, too fast.
Way too much. Documentation should be thorough, yeah.
Yeah. But it's got to be digestible, too.
I can see that. If it's overwhelming, it's not actually helpful.
Not helpful at all. The key is to provide clear and concise explanations
Right.
and use things like diagrams and flowcharts to break down anything that's like super complicated.
Visuals, yeah, those can be really helpful.
Developers tend to be visual thinkers.
Makes sense.
Oh, and don't forget about real-world examples.
Right.
Show developers how the API is actually used. Give them some code snippets they can just copy and paste into their own project.
Yeah, so they can see it in action.
Exactly.
It's
Like
like
way more helpful than just reading about it.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of making things easier, there are tons of tools out there to help create and manage API documentation.
Oh, yeah. There's a bunch.
And Robbins mentions quite a few of them. What's cool is how these tools are becoming more than just static repositories for documents. They're becoming more dynamic.
Dynamic? Like how?
Well, take Swagger, for example.
Well-
It can actually generate documentation directly from your API code.
Oh, wow.
Huge time saver.
That's impressive.
Right. And then you've got Postman. Is you familiar with Postman?
Yeah, I'd use Postman a bit for testing.
For testing, right. Well, it's expanded to include some really powerful documentation features, too.
No kidding.
Yeah, you can create interactive tutorials right within Postman.
Wow.
So developers can actually test API calls directly from the documentation.
So it's like a sandbox where they can play around without breaking anything?
Exactly. And as APIs get more complex and they're becoming more and more intertwined with our lives,
Right.
these tools, they're going to be crucial.
Yeah, definitely. One of the coolest things Robbins talks about is how API documentation, it's not just about the tech changing. It's tied to how businesses themselves have evolved.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
I like that.
It's like the internet opened up all these new ways for businesses to connect with customers, with partners,
Directly, yeah.
and APIs became the key to making all that happen.
So like those early web services Robbins mentioned?
Exactly. They're mostly focused on communication inside a company,
Uh-huh.
but as the internet grew, businesses realized APIs could help them reach way beyond their own walls, like setting up shop in the digital world.
And just also a real store needs clear signs, right? So customers know where to go.
Right.
APIs need that same clarity for developers.
Exactly. And as more businesses moved online, competition got fierce.
Oh, yeah.
So they realized having really great API documentation, that could give them an edge.
A competitive advantage.
Yeah. Robbins, he compares it to like having friendly, helpful staff in a store.
Oh, okay.
It makes customers want to come back.
Right.
Same with APIs. If a developer has a good experience with your documentation, they're more likely to choose your API over someone else's.
So it's not just about providing information, it's about creating a good experience.
Exactly. It's about the whole developer experience.
And companies like Twilio and Stripe, they got this from the start. They built their whole business around APIs.
They did. And Robbins points out how they made developer-focused documentation a priority right from day one.
So developers are their most important customers.
In a way, yeah. Robbins also talks about knowing your audience.
Oh, right. When you're creating documentation.
Yeah. What are some things to remember when you're writing for developers?
Well, they're a pretty technical bunch.
Oh, yeah.
So you can't write API documentation like it's a user manual for, a toaster.
Right. Gotta assume they've got some technical know-how.
Right. And use language that makes sense to them.
But you don't want to be so technical that it's overwhelming. There are so many tools out there to help create and manage API documentation.
Yeah, we talked about Swagger and Postman earlier.
Right. But Robbins mentions a few others that are worth checking out.
Oh, what else does he recommend? I'm always curious about new tools.
Well, for smaller projects or teams that don't need all the fancy features,
Okay.
he suggests things like Markdown
Markdown, yeah.
and platforms like GitBook.
Simple but effective.
Yeah, Markdown is easy to learn,
Right.
and GitBook lets you structure and publish the documentation in a way that's easy to use.
That's a good starting point.
Yeah, perfect for getting started.
What about bigger teams with more complex needs?
For them, Robbins mentions platforms like Readme.
Readme, okay.
It's designed specifically for API documentation.
Yeah.
It has features like dynamic examples.
Dynamic examples, huh?
Yeah, so developers can interact with the API right from the documentation.
Wow.
And it has developer analytics too, so you can see how people are actually using it.
That's cool. So you can make it even better based on how people are using it.
Exactly. Then there's Doxygen.
Doxygen, okay.
That one's popular for generating documentation straight from the code itself.
Oh, so less manual work.
Yeah, it's a big time saver, especially for large projects.
And as we look ahead, we can expect even more advanced tools. powered by AI and machine learning.
Oh yeah, AI. That's a game changer.
Imagine documentation that adapts to your specific skills, experience, and how you learn best.
It's like having your own personal API tutor.
That would be incredible. And as APIs become more and more complex,
Right, they will.
that kind of personalized help is going to be so important.
Definitely. It's amazing to think about how far API documentation has come.
And where it's going?
It used to be an afterthought. Now it's essential for successful software development.
Absolutely. And Robbins, he really emphasizes that it's all about communication.
Right, bridging the gap between complex systems and the people who use them.
So we can use technology to solve problems, create new things, make our lives better.
And as we move on to the last part of our deep dive, I think it's important to remember the human element.
The human element.
API documentation, it's more than just technical specs. It's about helping people understand and use these tools.
To build amazing things.
Exactly. I'm left wondering, what role will API documentation play in the future of work?
It really makes you think about how much we rely on APIs already, every day, even if we don't realize it.
Right, like ordering food through an app.
Yeah, food delivery.
Booking a ride, checking the weather. It's all powered by APIs.
It's all happening behind the scenes. But it's what connects everything.
Exactly. And that connection, it's only going to get stronger as technology keeps advancing.
So something like API documentation, which might seem kind of niche, could actually have a huge impact.
Yeah, across all sorts of industries, and even the skills people need for jobs in the future.
You know, Robbins, he talks about treating developers like your most important customers.
He does.
And I was thinking that idea, it applies to more than just developers, right?
I think so, yeah. It's not just about catering to the programmers who are using your API directly.
It's about realizing that anyone who needs to use these complex systems,
Right.
they need clear communication. They need user-friendly documentation.
Regardless of their technical background.
Exactly. So like if someone in marketing needs to pull data from an analytics API
Okay.
to track how well their campaign's doing,
Right.
or a financial analyst who needs real-time market data, good documentation can make their job so much easier.
It can. It's like breaking down the walls between technical and non-technical teams.
And making everyone more collaborative.
Exactly. And that brings us back to what Robbins was saying about the key qualities of good documentation.
Consistent formatting, clear explanations.
Real-world examples, those are all important no matter what kind of technical documentation you're creating.
Makes it more user-friendly.
You know, one thing Robbins really stressed was the importance of those real-world examples.
Show, don't tell.
Exactly. Don't just explain an API endpoint in some abstract way.
Right.
Give a concrete example. Show how it's used in a real situation.
Makes it so much easier to understand.
Like the difference between reading a recipe and watching a cooking show.
Oh, yeah. The cooking show, you actually see how it's done.
Right. And those real-world examples, they can even spark new ideas.
Get those creative juices flowing.
Exactly. But we've been talking about the good stuff. What about the bad? What happens when documentation is poorly written?
Well, I imagine it's pretty frustrating.
Frustrating is an understatement. If a developer can't figure out how to use your API because the documentation is bad,
it's a waste of time.
it's a huge waste of time.
And energy.
They might even give up on your API completely.
And go find a competitor with better documentation.
Exactly. Or they might make mistakes.
Which can lead to
bugs, delays, even security problems.
So good documentation isn't just about being nice to developers.
No.
It's about protecting your business.
Making sure your products and services are successful.
It's all part of the user experience.
Whether your users are developers, your own internal teams.
Even end users who are using apps that rely on your API.
Right. You know, as we wrap up this deep dive, it makes you appreciate the bigger picture. API documentation, it's really a testament to the power of communication.
It's about connecting those complex systems with the people who need to use them.
So we can use technology to its fullest potential.
To solve problems, create new things, make our lives better.
It's a really fascinating field, and it's constantly changing. I encourage everyone listening to check it out.
You might be surprised by what you learn.
You might even become the next API documentation guru. And remember, as tech keeps evolving, clear, concise, and engaging documentation is only going to become more important.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those APIs humming.